Hello, Simone. I'm excited to be here with you today. Today, we are going to be talking about one of our more controversial ideas that I had recently, and it changed the way I saw a lot of things, which is the concept of cultural carrying capacity, meaning that the carrying capacity of a region is determined by the culture that lives within that region. Now, this may seem obvious to an individual, but it is actually very, very spicy if you break it down more.
I think it's only obvious from an environmental standpoint. So most people are familiar with the concept
carrying
of
capacity.
Carrying capacity. When you think about a swamp, right? There's only so much water in the swamp. There's only so much algae in the swamp. And when you look at population levels of the swamp, you're either going to see what's called an S curve, where basically the population goes up, like not enough algae's, available anymore, and it starts to go down a little bit. It sort of regulates. And in a really bad scenario, you get what's called a J curve, where like maybe an invasive species enters the swamp. They completely consume everything. The swamp becomes basically a dead zone, and you have like a huge population crash. But like the carrying capacity is, how much can this environment sustain in terms of one population or a mixture of populations? And this came up when Malcolm was debating.
Well, hold on. Before you go further, just to summarize so that they understand why this is spicy, is essentially what we're going to be arguing is that the carrying capacity of a region is heavily determinant when you're talking about the number of people that can live in it, because that's very important when you're talking about global population, demographic class, everything like that, is heavily determined on the cultural group within that region, which is culture is often heavily tied to ethnicity. So like cultural ethno groups. And the number of people a region can support depends on which one of those we might be talking about, cultural groups we might be talking about. So continue.
Yeah, this came up in the context of Malcolm having a discourse or debate with some college students on a college campus. And one of them brought this up in the context of a particular region and was like, well, this region.
I might be able to. So we were discussing demographic collapse, right? And I was talking about my own, cultural region, which is the Greater Appalachian Cultural Group. And one of the students there was from the Greater Appalachian Cultural Group. And he was reflecting on, the poverty of the area that he grew up. And he's like, we have extended beyond the carrying capacity of the region. There were just too many of us for the region. And like we just had too many kids, and this was a bad thing, and now it's strained the region. And I remember at first I was like really perplexed by the stupidity of this point.
I didn't even understand what he was saying.
Yeah, basically what he was saying is our people bred too much, and now like hospitals are shutting down due to economic collapse, and schools are shutting down due to economic collapse in the region, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, well, that happens also because of demographic collapse. And he goes, well, this isn't happening here because of demographic collapse. It's happening for economic reasons because we have extended beyond our carrying capacity. And I just remember in my head, I was very confused. I was like, first of all, cultures are not isolated to one region. If you had outbred for your region, especially given that demographic collapse is happening all around you, you could just migrate into adjacent regions, right? Like you're not like bound to West Virginia, buddy. But then like even if that was true, what he was saying. But then I was like, but also like, if you were to be very offensive here, because this is the group I was using as a foil, Jews, like you put a bunch of Jews and a lot more Jews than are in like, let's say West Virginia, per region in a desert like Israel, they're able to turn it into a thriving economy, right? Manhattan has a higher carrying capacity, right? Like they're not farming there because we live in a world today where you can farm in other locations in the location that you are based. You can import food into that location. Your carrying capacity of a region is not at all determined by the actual food that region can produce.
Right. It's no longer, and this should be fairly obvious to people, determined by like the Malthusian limits of the agricultural load of a particular region. It is determined by your ability to buy the resources that you need to support whatever population you have.
And build the operational machine
infrastructure. Yeah.
That can do that.
You can't even, like literally, you can't even domestically produce, even if you don't want to buy them. Using technology, you can domestically produce the energy using nuclear, for example, that you need, and the food, even in an urban area. I mean, a lot of people are making really cool technology.
So I'm saying all this
agriculture
with a disparagement to my own people, right? Like, so you can't be like, I'm being racist here or something like that. I'm like, why don't we look at what the Jews are like, the way that they culturally work, and take cultural technology from them to become better ourselves, right? And people can be like, well, what about on a global scale, right? Like, surely the Earth has like a carrying capacity, and I'm like, it just effing doesn't. Like, or at least we're nowhere near it right now in terms of, let's say, food production as a
I mean,
human.
so we have a carrying capacity that can be moved on a slider up and down based on the extent to which we're willing to use various technologies or innovate around problems.
No, but this is what I'm talking about. So people, well, I think it's something like 3%. If you put solar panels on just 3% of the Sahara, you would produce as much energy as the entire world consumes on like a daily basis. So like the amount of energy. So like suppose you had a region that like actually had grown beyond their need for food, and they were a very technologically adept society, right? And they're like, okay, we need more food. What do? Well, you take a region of the Sahara, you put a bunch of solar panels down, you then use those solar panels to like infuse to get the energy you need to infuse dirt with various chemical processes and stuff like this to revitalize the dirt. And then you could create like infinite greenhouses, right? Because you've also got the sun there, and you just need to darken it enough to make it good for the plants in that region. And then you use the batteries that are powered in that region to have like an endless thing of like automated helicopters going from there to wherever you are, your little settlement is, constantly bringing food, or deep ocean agriculture or stuff like that. Like we have the technological capability to do this. Like the Netherlands, little bitty the Netherlands produces something, I'm like, find this in post, like 80% of like even like large exports, I think it's like potato exports or something like that. So they produce 20 to 25% of global tomato exports. 20 to 25% of tomatoes are produced just in the little bitty Netherlands. They produce around 20% of global potato exports. They produce around 25 to 30% of global onion exports. Little tiny, tiny, tiny the Netherlands. They are the world's second largest exporter by value of global agricultural exports, only behind the United States.
Well, and Venice was another really great early example of this. You literally have a swamp region. They don't have the stuff they need to sustain themselves, but they made it work.
Yeah, and you see this, like, what's the carrying capacity of a spaceship, right? The carrying capacity of a spaceship is determined by the technological acumen and willingness to lean in of the culture that inhabits that spaceship, right? And it's going to differ between cultural groups. So this is going to become like today on Earth. The idea of a cultural carrying capacity may not be an important concept, but it's going to be a very important concept when we're talking about space travel. Right.
Yeah, I think in a recent interview with the All In podcast, Elon Musk was saying something along those lines of like, it doesn't really matter what happens with the first contingent that goes to Mars. What happens is, when do we get to the point where the Mars colony can sustain itself and no longer relies on resupply ships? You saw this with the early American colonies. There were a lot that died out waiting for a resupply ship to come. And that is because they could not sustain themselves without it.
Yeah, but this is about multiple things within a cultural group. This is about not just the culture's ability to, grow food and engage with technology that can handle stuff like that,
a lot,
or create things that people want to trade food for, right? But it also, when you're talking about spaceships and off-world colonies, will come with the group's own desires for excesses, right? Like a group that overeats, or a group that desires particularly tasty foods, or a group that desires, the more, predilections for, like, let's say recreational sex a group has, the more resources they are going to consume and the less efficient they are going to be, right? And these are things that might end up mattering a lot when we can begin to edit people's genomes to like code for different preferences. So yeah, I think that this concept is going to be critical for space travel. And as I've talked about, the next part of this came from the thing the next guy said in the room, because I thought that this was really interesting and helped me move this concept forward as well. So then this black guy, very obviously woke, he was like, well, I think it's really ignorant to say that, most group differences are due to cultural differences. And I was like, well, it's actually the best way to look at things, right? Because you have three potentialities. I'm talking to a college class here. I'm not going to say that genetic differences matter, but I'm like, you have only really, well, I'll add in one wild card. So we'll say 4 reasons why different groups are different. Okay, you can either say it's completely random, which makes no sense. Otherwise, you wouldn't see it consistently across groups and across regions. Okay, you can then say, well, it's because of cultural differences. right? Like if you watch our, Asians don't actually have a higher IQ, the results are actually way weirder. Or we point out that like one study showing the Asians spent like 11 extra hours a week on homework assignments, right? Like obviously they're going to outperform other groups if they're working harder and they're studying more, right? And then the final explanation, which is the one that the wokies default to, but is actually a very, very bad explanation, toxic explanation to normalize, is that groups are cheating. That's the reason for differences. And those are really the only explanations. There is no other explanation for group differences, right? And if those are your only explanations as to like why the Appalachians aren't doing as well, and then you look at a group that's doing better than you, like say Jews, as I've mentioned, Jews out earn most groups. They are
Well, and by cheating, I think he's referring to what in general the urban monoculture would refer to as systemic racism or like systemic inequality.
Right. They have established cultural barriers that favor their own group, right? Or legal barriers or something like that.
Cumulative disadvantages that cannot be overcome.
Right.
So unfortunately, there's plenty of examples of cumulative disadvantages that have been repeatedly overcome.
Yeah, repeatedly overcome. So which we'll get to in just a second, but if you have this perspective, right, then you have to assume you as a group that is suffering can't say I'm going to learn from another group that's doing better than me in some area, right? You have to assume that they just need to be punished because they have essentially stolen from you. And to me, I find this to be a psychotic explanation. I wish I'd gone over this at the time. At the time, what I said was, and why would you? It's not that because I was trying to be, magnanimous and genteel in this situation and been like, hey, look, we're just looking at this from the perspective of raising our own kids. And there's really no utility in telling our own kids that the system is rigged against them. Because if we focus on the system being rigged against our kids,
they're going to develop an external locus of control, which is correlated with really bad outcomes. If you want to screw someone over, give them an external locus
depression,
of control.
Lower academics,
all you can do is deal with the hand of cards that has been dealt to you. And if you want to be able to deal with it successfully, you need an external locus of control, meaning that you only have a few levers you get to play.
An internal
and one is culture. So an internal locus of control. The two levers that you can play, regardless of the hand that you've been dealt with, is your culture and whether or not you want to cheat or play the game. I just think it's playing the game.
Before we get to the cheating, because Simone, you had a brilliant idea around cheating not always being a bad thing that we'll get to, but I wanted to go over something else before we get to that idea. Okay. Is that what you're about to get to, or?
Yeah, but go ahead.
Okay, I want to go over what I should have said, because I don't know why I didn't think of this at the time, but I was like, okay, so, I'm a white person here. Like Japanese people, clearly they were in internment camps. They had everything taken from them fairly recently in American history. And now they out earn us. So should I assume that they're cheating? Like, should I assume that they have cheated us white people because they are doing better than us? Like, that's a psychotic way to look at the world instead of trying to look at the things they're doing well and adopt those cultural practices myself. And so this perspective where you don't accept. And here I am saying, I think that if they could get themselves to breed, different question here, Japanese people would probably have a higher cultural carrying capacity than people of the greater Appalachian cultural group, my people, right? For numerous reasons. And that's fine for me to admit, right? Like, why is that so toxic to be like different people are different and therefore we can learn from them, right? But I want to go to this idea that you had that I thought was so clever, because I was like, look, we can say, some groups cheat and that's bad, right? And you're like, but Malcolm, it's not always bad. And I was like, what do you mean it's not always bad? Go into it.
Well, one person's cheating is another person's looking at the system, finding an arbitrage play and making it. And I presented the example of ethnic cartels, which we did an episode on. This idea of that we have the Patel motels, we have a ton of Indian-owned 7-Elevens, we have a ton of, I think, Indonesian-owned donut places in California and Vietnamese nail salons. There are all these groups that are coming from very little advantage. And this is typically these ethnic cartels, as they're called sometimes, are typically started by just one man who then goes on and uses an extended family network and then a larger network of new immigrants from his national background to build up what sort of becomes an empire. They are not advantaged. What they do is they see that, oh, here's this industry. Not a lot of capital and hard work is going into it because this is not glamorous and no one wants to do the work. Well, I'm going to go into this. I'm going to utilize basically my systematically disadvantaged group that's willing to work below market, where we have high cultural and social trust. We're going to provide cheap credit to each other, and we're going to own this industry. And they do. So playing the game or cheating, finding arbitrage opportunities. And
this episode hasn't gone live yet, but it's like insane. Like for example, what was it? Who owns like nail salons?
You put it live, didn't you? Pretty
No,
sure.
it hasn't gone live yet. No. Who is it who owns nail salons again? It was
Vietnamese. And so Vietnamese nail salons are so pervasive now that in California, it can be difficult to find a class that is not in Vietnamese, because that is just how.
Believe the point here being is do we believe that Vietnamese dominate the nail salon industry because of Vietnamese culture? No, I don't think so. Do we believe it because of Vietnamese genetics? No, I don't think so. It is a system that they put in place that took advantage of an industry that other people weren't as focused on.
Well,
right?
if you want to look at like Jewish groups and banking, they lived in environments where the pervasive or the dominant population was unwilling to engage in various elements of banking, like interest meaning
so
debt.
you as an individual, like black kid here who's like scolding me for not being woke enough in my thinking, if he wanted to like help the black community, start one of these. There have been black ethnic cartels before, right? Like you can do this. You just, because of your externalized focus, you refuse to, right? Like you're not helping your own community by taking the externalized focus and focusing on the ways that other people have wronged you.
I mean, I think it's okay to acknowledge that a group has been mistreated and that sucks, but I think that takes all of a sentence, like, yeah, that was a dick move, whoever did that. Don't do that. But yeah, to be like, and this is why I can't do anything, and this is why it's pointless for me to try, is the most harmful thing you could possibly do to this group that was disadvantaged. That's what really gets me. Like, if you care about the group, you need to care about what's going to solve the problem, not about who did it. Because in the end, bringing justice isn't even really that satisfying. And also it's kind of impossible at this point because most of the people who are involved in this are pretty dead. And this idea of like reparations, for example, where like people who had no personal responsibility in making certain things happen are expected to pay for something they never did, is just so beyond ridiculous to me that it's just not a productive conversation to have at all. It is frustrating. I'm a little like, you didn't have to mention that student was black. It could be anyone.
But in the context, it did matter because he was trying to use his status, in the urban monoculture, in the normative cultural framework of our society. Black people have the right to sort of shut down white people when they're talking about stuff like this, which was what he was expecting. He started the conversation was, it's ignorant of you to say X, like that there are cultural differences between groups that lead to outcomes, clearly implying that I was being like racist or not aware of like the woke rules around what I'm allowed to say.
So you're saying that he tried to undermine the open debate that you were trying to organize.
He tried to use his identity to undermine the open debate that I was trying to organize, even when it was obviously true. And even when like it does not take a genius to be like, hey, the Japanese people didn't cheat their way into economic success. And I was specifically, when I was talking about all this, talking about the two groups I had talked about was Japanese Americans, because I had talked about, not Japanese, Asian Americans, I had talked about them working more on homework, and the Appalachian cultural group. Black people didn't come up. They were not a part of this conversation.
Yeah. In other words, just for more context, Malcolm was sort of midway through arguing why we think culture is so important and that it isn't actually genetic differences that we're so interested in. That it's not like, oh, this group's smarter than the other, because you pointed to the anecdote that, okay, while many Asian students on average have much higher test scores, when you look at the data, they also spend 12 hours per week on average more than non-Asian students on studying. So like, are you shocked that they're performing better in school? Like,
yeah, and then we go over like the IQ tests and everything like that and show that they're not like gifted, right? Like uniquely, it's that they're working harder, and that's a cultural difference. Now, genetics may play a role in that as well. I'm not going to, ignore that. But the reason why I don't focus on genetics that much is because you can't change it.
Yeah, not yet. And then once you can change it, then it doesn't matter because you can change it if you want to.
The genetics is irrelevant in the same way as societal, sort of structural systems are largely irrelevant, because both of them are are things that are baked into me that I can't change right now. And so if I'm focused on my own children's success and my own family's success, which should always be my number one concern, these people who try to like reorganize society around their objectives and goals, it's so utopian and obviously doomed to fail. Everyone who's ever tried it, like, it leads to evil when you try to reorganize society in that way. So don't, like, focus on your family.
Yeah. So I guess the takeaway you want people to have is, I mean, aside from the fact that you need to think about environments not in terms of their environmental carrying capacity as a human, but rather their cultural, your personal cultural carrying capacity in that context. But also, there are really, out of the fact that there are quite a few levers, you know, including randomness, including history and genetics, the levers that you can pull at this time are culture and playing the system. And some people are going to call that cheating. Other people are going to call that arbitrage plays. But you just have to know that it kind of doesn't matter what hand you got dealt.
Yeah.
Like when people are playing poker, they're not like, well, I'm never going to play this game again because I didn't like the hand I was dealt. Like, I'm just going to stop playing. Like, no, you have to, like, maybe you can bluff. Maybe, you know, wait for another hand, like fold.
But think about this from the perspective of the species more broadly, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're talking about species and you're talking about carrying capacity of a region, right? The carrying capacity of a particular region differs greatly based on the species that is exploiting that carrying capacity, that is living within that region. Carrying capacity is species specific. Why is carrying capacity species specific? Carrying capacity is species specific because species have different behavior and because they have different biology, right? If human cultural groups have different behaviors, intrinsically, human cultural groups, just like different species, are going to have different carrying capacities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But
also in different environments too, depending on what they're good at and what they do.
But the wider takeaway from this is that I think people have a responsibility to, one, sort of understand or build a cultural group, understand what is limiting that cultural group's carrying capacity. Why is that cultural group failing or succeeding? What are areas that other cultural groups could do better, right? Like, because the ability of a group to export specific things, right? Like whether it's money or banking or you know, call center services or AI tech, right, is going to differ between the group's cultural specialization. And you can look at something like, let's say, Black Americans. Like, Black Americans very clearly dominate the music industry, right? Across musical genres, mind you. Even in country music, like I think Shabuzi is like the #1 country musician, right? So even in like classically white, potentially even groups that will have like in-group racial motivation around whiteness, Black people can still outcompete white people in the music industry. And so if you're like, how do I get better? Like, I want my kids to be great musicians. Look at what the Black community is doing, right? Like, clearly they're doing something you're not doing, right? So it doesn't just go in one direction. It's not like always do what the Jews do. It's do what the Jews do when the Jews are out competing you within that domain. And it's something that you can adopt. Which is funny because not all cultures have this way. I've talked about it in other episodes, but I think it's interesting. If you look at in China, they're very open to this. Like, there's lots of books of like how to get rich like Jew, how to raise kids like a Jew.
In China.
In China.
Yeah.
Where they're like, oh, this group seems to be out competing other groups. Like, we should.
How do I do that? Yeah, and that's the healthy approach. Like, we laugh at it because it's, you don't see it in the United States, but I think we laugh at it also because it's surprising, but it makes sense. Like, oh, we really probably should be asking how we can get rich like a Jew. Like, clearly they figured something out and I want that thing. So can we maybe learn from them instead of be like, they're cheating somehow. It's not fair.
Yeah.
Because they've been through it. They've been through it, Malcolm. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting concept. And to be fair, the students in this debate also had a lot of really interesting and insightful and eye-opening things to say. I enjoyed it a lot. It just happens to be.
Thought you had the major interesting revelations, but you have them when you're talking to other people.
That cheat good?
Yeah, the cheat codes can be ethical, right? Like that all the cultural cheat codes you have access to are not unethical. And I was quite impressed with the idea of, like, once I began to think about cultural carrying capacity, it became so effing obvious to me. And it all of a sudden I started to ask, like, you're really looking at not just demographics, because we often look at demographic collapse. How do you motivate higher reproductive rates, but
Mm.
you're looking at how do you motivate higher reproductive rates alongside a culture that would have a high carrying capacity?
Yeah. What I think also is people set up their techno-fiefdoms in an age of post-demographic collapse techno-feudalism. They need to be thinking specifically about the environments they choose and how their unique culture is going to make it work in those environments.
I'd also note here that I would have a modifying criteria within the concept of cultural carrying capacity as we look at it going forwards,
Yeah.
which I would call the technological coefficient,
Okay.
or let's say the industrial coefficient. So the industrial coefficient is the modification to population number of resources consumed contrasted with the amount of productivity you get based on that culture. So I'll explain what I mean by this, okay?
Okay.
You could be a culture that goes into a region and can significantly outbreed your neighbors, right? Like you can have X many people living in a region because your culture doesn't mind people starving to death all the time, right?
Mm.
You just do not care, right? Like whatever, I'm just going to keep breeding until I start starving and my kids start starving, right? And there's lots of
Mhm.
cultures like this.
Yeah, there's just kind of a norm in
Well, it's a norm in the animal world. It's a norm in some parts of the human world.
well, and yeah, historically it was a pervasive norm in many parts of, if not all parts of the
Of the
human
human world,
world.
yeah.
Yeah.
But there's other cultural groups which artificially limit their sort of carrying capacity and redirect resources, whether it is energy, well, energy is the main one, energy or material supplies, into the production of industrial capacity. And that can be in the form of artificial intelligence, that can be in the form of automated factories, that can be in the form of robotics, etc. And that we need to keep in mind the amount of output a culture is getting as something that is measured alongside their total population.
Mm.
Because you might have two of these populations, the one that has no technology but just breeds until they start starving, and the one that's like it redirects, let's say 80% of the actual energy, because that's like the core unit. That is what we are getting from the plants that we eat is energy ultimately. And if you have energy, you can ultimately make food. It might be lossy, but eventually all food is convertible to energy and all energy is convertible to food with sufficient technology. And they're putting the majority of their energy not into the creation of new humans, but into industrial capacity. That needs to be measured because that has an impact on their ability to exert their cultural will on the neighbor with a lower industrial coefficient.
Mhm.
And this becomes increasingly important when you're talking about interstellar colonies, interspaceship competition, and stuff like that. Your spaceship may only have, 10 humans living in it who are like genetically augmented and created, and another might have 1,000 people living on it, but they just don't have anything close to your level of technological output because you're living in a closed system and you're always deciding, am I putting my energy into food that humans are consuming and metabolizing, or am I putting it into industrial production?
Mhm.
Thoughts on that idea?
And it may make sense. I think, though, in the future, this kind of thoughtfulness is going to inherently be built into things like space colonies, where it needs to be considered more thoughtfully is in the more grassroots communities that are arising. So, someone in response to our demographic collapse video, where we sort of talk about a post-collapse world, said it's all fine and well that these charter cities are popping up for really wealthy people and groups, but what about the rest of us, right? Like, I'm not getting an invite to this. So what am I going to do? And I pointed out that there are also city-state movements. One example being Return to Land, where they have a cultural affinity and they're building a community around it, where it doesn't really matter that they don't have special privileges from the state because either they're trying to work within existing laws, which is what Return to Land is doing, or at the point of demographic collapse, no one's really going to be enforcing stuff anyway. So, if you can defend yourself and fly under the radar, it doesn't really matter how you govern internally because there's no one else there to pay attention. But I think the important thing for these lower tech communities to be thinking about, because they're not necessarily coming from sophisticated resource management and business and investing backgrounds, or even, from permaculture backgrounds, they need to really be thinking about, if they're low tech, the actual environmental carrying capacity of the land on which they're choosing to settle, or if they're coming at this from a higher tech perspective, but just very grassroots and bootstrapped, how to combine their cultural carrying capacity with the environmental carrying capacity. Some people I've been chatting with are like, well, maybe we'll go into mining, right? Getting rare earths, because that's probably going to be a growing industry. That is one way where they can be in a more hostile environment, but still have high cultural carrying capacity that allows them to survive and thrive, despite not being surrounded by, a very fertile, permaculture friendly environment. If they combine the two of them, then even better.
Yeah. And while I mentioned this a few times, I really need to, once we begin to think about humanity's future and our manifest destiny among the stars, and the concepts we're going to need to culturally normalize to when space travel becomes normal, it will become very obvious to people that many of the cultural taboos in terms of stuff we can talk about today need to be dropped. The idea that genetic differences aren't real, or the idea that, and note here, I'm not talking about between ethnicities. I would never say that. That's I don't want to be pilloried here. I'm just talking about between individual humans, that some humans are born, smarter than other humans, or with different capacities than other humans. And to not see an advantage that you've had your entire life is not being magnanimous.
It's being massively insensitive.
Yeah.
And pretending that, people who were born with your exact same background or possibly systemic privileges as a whatever class person just didn't work as hard as you. When really, no, maybe they were born with a very different set of genetic traits. It doesn't give them the same combination of drive and intelligence that enabled you to perform so well. Anyone who's had multiple kids knows that their kids are gifted with different strengths and with different drawbacks depending on the environment, right? And so to pretend that this is a group-wide thing is totally insensitive.
We're gonna have to drop that. We're gonna have to drop the idea that culture isn't different. Culture is different, and not every cultural group can get along with every cultural group. You can import people willy-nilly into your country that think that people should be able to force a 9-year-old girl to get married to someone she doesn't want to, and that's culturally normal. See our video on, because we're not arguing this as outsiders. This is something the Pakistani Islamic court argued. They said it was Islamophobic to ban child forced marriage. And they're, at least within their own cultural concept, are right about that. But when you import those people willy-nilly into an environment like Germany or something like that, we have a totally different culture. Like, both groups have a right to their own culture, but they may not be compatible. It can be, right now, we can pretend that they're actually incompatible, but when you put them on a spaceship together, it'll become obvious real quick that these two groups cannot live alongside each other, and then you get a genocide, right? Like, that's what happens when you force groups that are incompatible with each other to live in enclosed spaces. This is also true with countries, right? Like, one of you had this reporter that's recently, and she's throwing this big fit about like ICE and everything like that, taking people out of the country. And I think you see this with Germany, right? Germany's in a worse situation now because they're taking even more incompatible immigrant groups and filling their country with it, right? To try to spam the vote in their favor. And the other side is eventually, right, like, this group coming into the country, it's like, I don't want to acclimatize to your culture. And given that means you only have two options. You either culturally genocide them by erasing a group that doesn't want to have their culture erased by taking their kids and adopting them into your culture, or you keep a group there that is actively hostile to your interests in your cultural system and wants a different government due to their religion, under Sharia law in the case of Germany. And so you're either eventually going to get cultural conflict between the two groups, which means killing and murder, or one of the groups eventually has to be expunged, right? Like, moved out of the country. And what we're seeing in the United States, it's not the fault of Trump that this sort of dragnet approach is happening. It's the fault of the group that, the analogy I used to Simone earlier is, it's like somebody invited a bunch of homeless people into my house while I was gone, and they were supposed to be homesteading for me. And I come back and a portion of the homeless people are like hostile and breaking things and stealing things. And I'm like, I need to expel those people. And they're like, well, if you expel them, you have to expel all of us, which is really the position the left is taking. Is I was like, well, then I need to expel everyone. And frankly, I never consented to this in the first place. Right? Like,
yeah. Well, interesting stuff, but the important stuff to think about as you build communities for the future. I'm going to go pick up Toasty for his ABA therapy.
All right, question on dinner tonight.
Yeah. Would you like...
Do we have anything frozen, or should we be going to like the
we still have tons of curries. Yeah.
Could I do a curry of some sort?
Yeah.
Just a reheated curry.
Absolutely.
With rice, because it's been a long time and I really like it.
Good. Let's do it. All right. I love you so much, Malcolm.
I love you so much, Simone.
Thanks for giving me a palate cleanser.
By the way, thank you for being okay with me pulling the trigger on a pretty big decision that you're gonna be making tomorrow? Just
Oh, I didn't have a good feeling about this from like for a
just
really long time. So
what was it? The team that you didn't have a good feeling about, or
yeah, the team, the direction, the lack of transparency, yeah, wasn't. I mean, I like the people individually, but they were never doing anything. They never indicated anything to me that implied that we were on the same page in terms of, hey guys, this is our mission. Our goal is to promote long-term human flourishing, raise awareness about demographic
yeah.
collapse, and spark important debates. And yeah, I'm not getting that read. So anyway,
Yeah.
let's go.
Hey guys, what are you doing? Oh my gosh, do you think that they might eat you? Because they're in a container? Those are gooey ducks, I think.